Charlemagne passed off the scene. He only had one surviving son, so at least the kingdom remained together while that son was alive. But then his son had 3 grandsons, and they split the land up. The split, now don't worry about the names of his 3 grandsons. Just know that when Charlemagne's kingdom was split, the one of them eventually became France. Another grandson got what eventually became Germany. And another grandson got what became just a bunch of hodgepodge of states. The Netherlands, Holland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and northern Italy just never became amalgamated. But France and Germany, today's boundaries, a lot of them are based on the division that Charlemagne's grandsons divided. And unfortunately, these grandsons had several sons, and in turn they had several more sons, and after a while each kingdom got smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally the kings of Europe realized, hey, we cannot keep giving every one of our sons our land. So they began to practice primogeniture, which we talked about before, the practice that only the oldest son inherits the crown. I mean, if you're a king, or if you're a nobleman, only the oldest son becomes a noble, and the other sons might get gifts or a little bit of money or some land, but it's understood that the real property owner is the oldest son. But in the meantime, though, the kingdom that Charlemagne had built up was destined to get smaller and smaller. While that the king's power got weaker and weaker, the nobility began to build up their power, and this was to lead to a further fragmentation of Europe, and it was to take Europe generations to build up strong central governments once again. Now, because Europe became weak, this encouraged outsiders to invade. Europe wound up having 3 types of invaders: the Vikings, a new group of Mongolians called the Magyars, and the Muslims. The Vikings poured down from Scandinavia. It's when you learn the name Scandinavia, we've mentioned it before. Vikings came from Scandinavia. They were from what is today Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And they would raid and then go back. Now, the Vikings are important in American history because it is now known, it's proven, that several Vikings came across the Atlantic and settled in what is today Iceland and Greenland, and even Nova Scotia. And Viking belts and Viking shields and helmets have been found as far west as Minnesota. Apparently the Vikings sailed down the St. Lawrence Seaway, sailed into the Great Lakes, and got as far as Minnesota. Viking ships were, we have found one of them buried in deep. We were able to revive it. They were pointed in both directions, which meant that they could sail up a river and turn around and sail back down a river without turning around. That was one advantage. The Vikings are also making news in modern time because of the gods they worshiped. They worship Odin and Thor, and movies are being made of these gods right now, particularly Thor and Odin and Loki and Frigga. The names, most of the names of our days of the week come from Scandinavians. Tuesday, named after Tur, who was the god of bravery among the Vikings, who gave his hand up, and so he's now pictured as a man missing his right hand. He gave his hand to the wolf, and the wolf cut a bit off his hand, and it was an act of bravery on Tur's part.
Thursday is Thor.
And then Thursday is Thor. Wednesday is Woden's day, or Odin. Wednesday is Odin, Thursday is Thor, Friday is Frigga, their goddess is the equivalent of Venus or Inanna, or Isis. Friday, Frigga's day, goddess. And so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, 4 days of the week, we get those names from the Vikings. Now, when the Vikings went to the New World, they encountered the American Indians, but the Vikings were hopelessly outnumbered. There was a superstition among the people when some stranger came, when you went to a strange land and some stranger came up, you would strike that person, try to make him bleed. If he bled, he was human. If he didn't bleed, he was a frailing. The Vikings, unfortunately, looked on the Eskimos as being demons, frailings or whatever, demons, and they refused to learn from the Eskimos, so this wound up making the Viking colony in Greenland become extinct. The Vikings were practicing in Greenland the same kind of farming they did back in Scandinavia. When the climate changed, that farming would not work. And the Vikings all perished. And if they would have only talked to the Eskimos knew how to thrive in that kind of environment. But they wouldn't, so the Viking colony in Greenland perished, and when the Vikings found them back 200 years later, they found the last of them dead. Having been dead for 200 years because nobody was around to bury them. And because, again, the climate apparently changed drastically during the time the Vikings were living in Greenland. But in Nova Scotia, the Vikings were forced out because the Indians simply outnumbered them. So the first encounter between European and Indian, the victory went to the Indians. 500 years later, the Spanish came, this time with gunpowder and larger ships and bigger numbers, and they came in droves. And the Indians' population had greatly declined over the 500-year period. And the result was the Indians were no match for the Europeans. The Magyars. There have been many groups of Mongolians that have come out of Mongolia through the ages. We first talked about the Huns. Well, the Magyars were related to the Huns. The Magyars, there was also the Avars, the Finns, the Bulgars, and eventually the Mongolians themselves, not to mention the Turks. That's not naming all of them. In the case of the Magyars, they were eventually met their match when they were defeated by the Europeans in a big battle, one of the important battles of world history. And then the Magyars went to Hungary, where their relatives, the Huns, had already settled. The Magyars settled down, became Christian. The Vikings eventually settled down also, became Christian. And but the Northmen, the Northmen settled in England, in Normandy. The word Normandy in France means Northman. Normandy, England, and Italy. There was a Viking colony in Italy. Vikings settled in these places and eventually became Christian and mixed in with the Europeans. The Magyars eventually became Christian and mixed in with the Europeans. The Muslims, the fight with them is going on. Has never stopped. The Muslims began to attack the southern coast of Europe. They took Sicily for a while. They attacked southern France. They were still fighting the Visigoths in Spain, and that fight was destined to go on for 800 years, when finally the Muslims were driven out in 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella. The conflict took a different turn when Europeans developed superior weaponry that the Muslims could not match. And eventually almost every Muslim nation was conquered by a European nation. Then the Europeans decided that it was naughty to conquer. And the result is the issues between Islam and the rest of the world are still going on. These raiders forced the nobility to keep armies, because for one thing, the kings were weak. So the nobles began keeping armies, something that had not been allowed before. Something that Cicero in Roman times had spoken hard against, but circumstances forced them. Now, which brings up to the next issue, the feudal system. F-E-U. The word feudal, it's been seen a little bit in India and a little bit in Japan, but it is mostly in Europe that we get the feudalism. It means you have the nobility are really in charge. There is a king, but he's a figurehead. He has very little authority, and most of the power lies in the hands of the local nobles. It was a system of vassalage. a vassal is someone who joins with a more powerful man and saying, hey, I will assist you in your fights, and if you'll protect me, I'll pay you a certain amount of goods and services, but in turn, can you protect me? It had been about 50 years ago, one of my brothers checked out a book from the high school library about the Crusades, and I'll never forget the opening sentence. It said, if you had lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, you would have been somebody's vassal. Everybody in Europe was a vassal. The Pope was a vassal of God. The Emperor was a vassal of the Pope. Kings were vassals to the Emperor. The dukes were vassals to the kings. The counts were vassals to the dukes. The viscounts were vassals to the count. And the knights were vassals to their own local lords. And the serfs were vassals to their lords. Practically everybody in Europe was somebody's vassal. You would, when you became somebody's vassal, you'd swear an oath called of fealty or loyalty. Essentially, you would kneel down in front of the person you were becoming a vassal to, and he would put his hands like this. You'd put your two hands together. He'd put his hands outside of yours. And you would swear an oath of loyalty to him, and he would in turn swear an oath to protect you. It was a way to protect yourself. The system of vassalage made assassinations rare. During about a 1,000-year period in Europe, we only have about 2 or 3 recorded assassinations. People simply would not assassinate a person who they had sworn an oath to help fight his wars. And this has become very important when we start talking about King John, because when King John got out of line, nobody wanted to remove him from office. Everybody in Europe, I mean in England, wanted to keep him king, but they simply said to King John, we want you to sign this document where you understand there's certain things you cannot do as king. He signed. The oath he swore was an oath of fealty, and he would do homage. In other words, homage was where he, the homage was a ceremony. The Middle Ages, the people in the Middle Ages just loved ceremonies. The Lord would often grant his vassals certain plots of land. This land became known as a fief. You notice I wrote that in cursive, it's a foreign word. That was the land that the Lord would grant to his knights or the people under him. But his assumption, hey, I still own this land, but you work it. It's yours as long as you work it, and just pay me a certain amount of the produce from the land. Now, at the heart of the armies of the Middle Ages was the armored knight. Now, your book says that knights were able to come on the scene because Europeans learned how to breed larger horses. But also there was something else. The European man became lighter, if you can believe his armor. Judging by the armor we now have, the average height of the European man was only about 4'6". It's very small. And here's why. I don't think it was because of bad diet so much as they married within their own class, within their own village.
They're all inbred.
And they were inbred. They were inbred. And this is what I think really made them lighter. So the men were lighter, and the horses were a little bit bigger and stronger. So this enabled the knights the knight in full armor to get on the back of a horse. They learned how to breed bigger and better horses, but not bigger and better humans. Eventually, as time went on, Europeans began to marry over the horizon, and today it's not unheard of for princes to marry common women or vice versa. The class distinction is not as strong as it once was, and the result is Europeans are getting better. The stirrup was invented also, and if any of you know anything about a horse, a stirrup enables a knight to mount his horse. Before this time, a knight would have to ask his squire, if your squire was a teenage boy trained to be a knight, hey, get down on all fours and I'll use your back to mount on my horse. But today, I mean, eventually the stirrup was invented, and they could use the stirrup to mount on a horse. To become a knight, you had to be the son of a nobleman. They just did not make ordinary people from low birth knights. Between the ages of 6 and 14, you'd serve as a page. When you were 14, you became a squire. As a squire, you were assigned to a knight, and you also learned how to handle weapons. And the knights were given about a few hundred acres each, and from this land they got their serfs to grow their crops. And this was how the knights were supported, from their serfs and from the crops that their serfs grew. There are different ranks of nobility. The king ruled over a nation. Now, if we had a feudal system here in America today, of course, you'd have the king of the United States, with the capital in Washington. Then there'd be the Duke of Georgia, the Duke of Tennessee, the Duke of Massachusetts, the Duke of Mississippi. And then the dukedoms would be the counties: Count DeKalb, Count Gordon, Count Bartow, Count Paulding, Count Cobb, and I've named some counties that are nearby, not far away. There's a county called Greene, Count Greene, Count Catoosa. I mean, these are the counties. And under the counties would be viscounts, viscount like our vice president. These are the people who served the counts. The title of baron varied from one place to another. Some of the barons were really high and some low. It varied greatly from place to place. England had earls, and eventually Scotland had earls. France and England also had a rank called a marquis, which might, in some cases, have been equal to a count. Now, also there were your bishops and archbishops. Most of the time, these people were from the nobility also. The local parish priest might have been a common-born man, but a noble man might have 3 sons. The oldest one he'd make a nobleman. The second one he might make a knight, and the third one, the youngest one, might become a bishop. If he was a really high nobleman, like a duke, and he had 3 or 4 sons, he'd make 1 or 2 of them archbishops. But most of the time, your high-up clergy came from the higher ranks of the nobility. Chivalry. Chivalry was the ideal of a medieval knight. The knight was taught the arts of chivalry from the time he was a squire. Basically, it defined a knight's relationship to a woman, and it set the standard for relationship between men and women that has lasted until recent times. Now, 50 years ago, we sat in my 10th grade high school class and discussed whether or not chivalry was dead, because, I mean, we were, as children, we were taught that, yeah, the man should pay when you ask a girl out, and the man should help the girl with his wraps and should open the door for a woman, whatever. Today, most of this stuff is gone by the wayside.
I don't agree with that.
What's that?
I don't agree with that.
Maybe if you don't agree, that's fine. I will say this. I mean, when I was back in 1987, I was still single. And I asked a young lady to go accompany me to Stone Mountain. So when we got to the gate, the guard at the gate, of course, asked if we paid. I started pulling on. You mean I have to pay to get in here? I said, yeah, I knew we had to pay to get in here. That's when so I came prepared to pay. She said, oh no, I don't want you to pay. I want to pay my own share. Well, see, she'd been unemployed for several months, and I'd been working in Lockheed for 7 years. I had more than enough money to pay her way and mine in. I did not like it, but I finally worked out a deal where she paid about a third, and I paid the other 2/3. Next day, I went to Lockheed and discussed this same episode at Lockheed, and one of the other single men said, yeah, a lot of my dates do that to me, and I don't like it.
There's a reason that he's a single man then.
But the impression that we get is these girls are telling us we're not your girl and we want to be. Again, if you can take her that what you want. What's that?
She's not your girl yet.
Okay, well, whatever. But I mean, I had always been that belief that, you know, I should pay. And again, I'd been to Stone Mountain before, and I knew that they charged a fee. And she lived in the Stone Mountains community and never been. She was in her 30s, and she'd never been to Stone Mountain, and did not know that it cost money to get in. Okay, I did. Okay, prepared. I was going to pay the whole thing, and without question, that was the first time I ran into that, and I ran into it a couple times later before I got married. But I understand talking a lot of today's girls insist that they pay their share.
Yeah, 'cause it's it's equality. It's like men are not the provider anymore. How it used to be in the past. I feel like, don't get me wrong, gender roles are blending a little bit, but I still think men are like protectors and women are like nurturers. But I mean, it's not the days of women not working anymore. And about how, what is it, like women make 71 cents per dollar for America?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
that's
actually-
still very true.
That is actually not due to sexism, but due to the ability to
Yeah,
work.
baby.
Because, like, if let's say you're pregnant or have a child, they have to work less hours. So that is the reason they get less pay, is because they're actually working less. And if you look at single father parents or like stay-at-home dads, you'll see the same exact 71 cents per dollar to the. It's not. I mean, it's not a sexist country, but it's not like a CEO is gonna like. It's a silly thought.
Anyone else? Again, whether or not chivalry is still alive, that's to be determined. Also, another thing, if you were coming to a bridge, and a bridge that had to just consist of about 3 logs, had room for only one person to cross. If you were a man and you started to cross and saw a woman coming toward you, you were expected to back off the bridge and let her go first and watch to make sure that she didn't fall in the water. This was part of that was part of the time. Now, of course, in the
You don't
case
think
of,
that'll happen today?
but in the case of, I don't think we'd have to, in the case of Robin
Get out of my
Hood,
way.
Little John,
Stiff arm
Robin,
in the face.
it was, the bigger man was expected to, the smaller man was expected to step aside. Otherwise, the bigger man would knock him down. So Little John encountered Robin Hood, and Robin Hood said, "No man makes me step aside." Well, Little John knocked him into the water. And some of you might have heard that story. But anyway, after that, they became fast, hard friends. Little John was a much bigger man than Robin Hood. In fact, Little John was one of the biggest men. That's why I got the name Little John, because he actually was the opposite of a little man. Any of you heard this story? I mean, okay, it's in the his folklore along with King Arthur. Tournaments. The tournament was where 2 knights would gallop at each other on horseback with spears and shields, and the one knight was expected to knock each other down. Now, the Renaissance Festival that I understand still goes on. My wife and I went to it when we first married, and when our kids came along, we quit going to it. But they used to have those tournaments. They were fake, and the knight who was knocked off the horse had a nice padded area to land on. But a lot of knights were permanently crippled as a result of being knocked off a horse. And eventually, kings realized they had to curtail the tournament activity. Sometimes it would be not just 2 knights, but whole teams of knights would slam into each other. The team that had the most knights still on the horse when it was over with, that was a team that won. But they would rode into each other full gallop, and when they collide at midfield, sometimes both knights were knocked off the horse. In that case, it was called a draw. But sometimes one knight was knocked off, or sometimes a spear would break. You might have seen some of this on television. Or again, they reenact it at the Renaissance Festival, which occurs usually around September. I got to throw this in. When I was at the Renaissance Festival, I had my camcorder with me taking pictures. And a fellow I knew came with me and said, "Hey, you'd better put that camcorder in its case because it's going to collect a lot of dust out here." I couldn't help but think, now wait a minute. If it's in its case, I can't take a picture with it. If it's out of its case, it'll collect dust. So what do? Well, I'm going to go ahead and let it collect dust because I want to take pictures. That's what I bought the thing for. So let it collect dust anyway. Now, of course, today's camcorders don't have any moving parts. So there's no tape, no motors, nothing like that. But in those days, we had to be careful of dust. But then, if it's inside the case, it won't collect dust. But man, guess what? It won't take any pictures either. What did it do? I know what I did. I left it outside the case. Okay, women. Somebody, it was either this class or they did a paper on women in the Crusades. And a few lines of your papers, I remember, and I forget who did it, but and I forget even if it was in class. One person said that we read in the history about wars and often forget about the plight of the people who have to actually go through them. Folk, I never forget. I mean, I was a young man once myself, and I joined the Army once, and I said to myself, I'll never look back and think this was easy when I was about to pass out during a long march carrying a heavy pack, and we'd been marching about 10 miles. I said, this was tough. But then I think of the men who are riddled with bullets, who are shot in the face, or, I mean, I think about it, and I'm thinking about wars. And yes, war is awful. But this paper said that we often forget about the horrors of the wars, or the pain and the misery that the people who go through them suffer. But anyway, but this person was writing about the role of women, particularly in the Crusades, and the most famous one was Eleanor. Now, I want to say this about European women. Because of the code of chivalry, and because of the love that Europeans had for the had for the Virgin Mary, and this applies to all Catholics, both Orthodox Catholic and Roman Catholic. Also, they both sides had a real, genuine, heartfelt love for the Virgin Mary. It tended to elevate women, but your book points out something else that made the women elevated, was the fact that their husbands were very, very often away at war, and in the case of the Crusades, they were away for long periods of time. So the women had to learn to manage the home. But also, when so many of your noble men died with only a daughter, eventually they said, well, to keep the estate in a family, let's allow, first they allowed the estate to be inherited through a woman, like if your maternal grandfather was a duke, and there were no relatives closer to your maternal grandfather than you, then you could become a duke yourself through a woman. The woman, your mother was not allowed to inherit, but then they eventually made it to where a woman who had no brothers could inherit an estate. The brothers got first priority, but the woman who had no brothers was allowed to inherit. Now, here, this takes us up to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most famous woman of the Middle Ages. Eleanor was the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, then one of the most powerful dukes in France, and he died without a male heir, so she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine. The King of France was very interesting because her domain was bigger than his. So, the King of France married her, and when he did, the King of France's domain went much bigger. The King of France was Louis VII. Now, here is a story about Louis VII. He was the son of Louis VI, and originally he was the second son. So the father put him in a monastery because the older brother was to inherit the throne. He said, you will never inherit the throne. You're my second son, so you go into a monastery and become a monk. So Louis VII went into a monastery and became a monk. Then all of a sudden his older brother died. And his father said to the church, okay, bring my second son out. He's now the heir. He's now my heir. But Louis VII never got over the fact that he was no longer a monk. So his wife Eleanor said, here, I thought I was marrying a king, and I find out I'm marrying a monk. But he was very, very religious, very pious, remained that way all his life. But as a king, he was expected to marry and to have sons. Well, as king, he married. He and his wife Eleanor had daughters only. Didn't have a son. Now, in those days, if a woman could not bear a son, she was blamed. In other words, it was her fault. Today, we are convinced from our knowledge of genetics, it's the man who determines the sex of the offspring, and not the woman. So what they would try to do to make sure they had a male heir was marry a woman who only had brothers. Like if a woman had 6 brothers, you was the only daughter, they believed that, hey, this woman is going to tend to have sons more than she does daughters. Now today we laugh at this, but this was the way they thought of things. Anyway, Louis VII went on a crusade and made the mistake of taking Eleanor with him. Eleanor was one of 50 women who went along, and these women passed from one man to another, including Eleanor. Finally, Louis VII had enough of this, and after an alleged affair with Eleanor, had an alleged affair with her uncle, Louis VII divorced her. Eleanor then went and eventually married Henry, the Duke of Anjou, and she bore Henry, who became King Henry II of England. She bore Henry 4 sons. After not being able to bear Louis VII any sons, she bore Henry II 4 sons. As for Henry VII, he married again. He got you might say, an indulgence from the church that allowed him to marry again after divorcing his first wife. So he eventually had 1 son, whom we'll talk about later. Well, Eleanor became an older woman, and as an older woman, she was no longer attractive to men. And also, Henry is just as unfaithful to her as she had been to her first husband. And finally, Henry got tired of her and put her in prison. And she remained in prison until her husband Henry died. And when Henry died, Richard de Lionheart took the throne. Richard had her released from prison. And
Is that they did with their wives back in the day? Like, I don't want to
in a lot of cases, yes, they did. Now, not the common people. I want to remind you, the rich have more problems with married life than the poor do. I mean, we discussed this once. And also, there's a saying going around. I mean, I'm only going to quote part of it. The prettier they are, and I'll scratch the rest of it. If anybody knows.
No, you gotta finish the saying.
No,
What is that? It's like, I got this really cool thing to tell you, but I can't tell you.
But in a lot of cases, the more attractive a man or woman is, the more likely they are to divorce. I mean, I have seen that myself. I mean, I was part of a singles group for a while, and the divorced women were so supremely, seemingly highly attractive. And I think to myself, you know, if only I could get one of those.
See, then one day I got those single groups, right?
Well, one day I got one of them, and I found out why that the men had to get rid of them.
Why?
Yeah. They tended, when they use their looks, to try to control them.
Oh.
Yes, they use their looks to try to control.
That's why you use your
I
hands.
mean, among other things, they think they get away with things that nobody should try to get away with. And after a while, you realize, hey, you know, I can't put up with this anymore. So anyway, leaving that. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine is said to have been the beginnings of something that we today call romance. The beginning of what today has become the Hollywood scene. The Hollywood scene is where the people hop from one partner to another. The folk don't misunderstand. This is not what I'm teaching, all right? But the feeling that, I mean, okay, the idea that love is only a feeling. It's a feeling you have. And you follow where your feelings lead you. And once the feeling goes, it's all over. The feeling will never come back. So again, you just simply leave the person you once had a feeling for and go to a next person you do have feelings for, and hop from one person to another. This scene that we find much too often in Hollywood, it went from Eleanor to Paris and went from there to the court of Louis XIV and Louis XV in France, where they practiced this kind of living, just going from one partner to another. And eventually it found its way to Hollywood. Again, in no way am I advocating this kind of life, but some of you might know a lot more about this than I do. A lot of your people in Hollywood have followed this kind of lifestyle. All right. Moving on to about European kingdom. We'll take a few of the main kingdoms, particularly starting with England, going from England to France, and from France to the Holy Roman Empire, and from the Holy Roman Empire to Russia. England. In 1066, don't worry about the date, but William the Conqueror William was the Duke of Normandy, and his father went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and his father never returned. So young William then became the Duke. Now, William was first called William the Bastard because he was illegitimate, but nevertheless, because his father had no other sons, William became the Duke on his father's death. And as Duke of Normandy, William was a playmate to the King of England, and the King of England promised William the throne when the king died. Well, the king died and William was not given the throne. Instead, a man named Harold, who had no blue blood in his veins, so basically Harold, King Harold of England, was not a member of a royal family. William said, I am related to royalty. So William got together an army, collected an army in France, crossed the English Channel, and defeated Harold and took the throne. From that day till this, with one exception, a man who never took the title of king, but one exception, all of your kings and queens of England, including Queen Elizabeth II, have been descended from William the Conqueror. Now, William the Conqueror gave England a strong monarchy, which was something that the rest of Europe didn't have. The Europeans had, at this point, had weak monarchs. Now, I'll interrupt the narrative, and I promise you, don't take this down. This is a bit of trivia that I throw in. In William's army, there was a soldier named Warnebald, whom we think came from the land of Belgium. They called it Flanders in those days. And Warnebald joined William's movement, being promised land. When William won, Warnebald was given some land in the northern part of William's realm in Scotland. The people living there had the surname of Cunningham, so Warnebald married a girl named Cunningham, and he took the name of Cunningham himself. And eventually his great-grandson got the title of Earl of the Cunningham County, and they remained earls until 1802, when the last one of them died without a male heir, but a daughter. And but he had not arranged for women to inherit, so the earldom has since become dormant. The Earls of Cunningham were destined to figure prominently in the Scottish history. Again, folks, that's just a little bit of trivia that I throw in about this time that you might obviously guess this has some meaning for me personally. Am I descended from Warnebald? All right, more than likely, and I'll tell you why. Keep in mind, you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 1632. By the time you get back 1,000 years, you have 2 million ancestors, assuming a 30 generation between here and there. 2 million ancestors. Likely, I am descended from almost every English person who was alive, high-born and low-born, at the time. Highly likely. Again, keep in mind, if somebody would offer you a penny doubling for 30 days or $1 million outright, which would you take, the penny doubling or the $1 million outright? Would you take the penny doubling? Anybody else? That's an excellent answer. At the end of 30 days, you'd have $2 million. If you don't believe it, get on your computer. 1 cent, 2. Oh, the first 10 days you'd starve. At the end of 10 days, you'd have 10 bucks. At the end of 20 days, though, you'd have a few $1,000s. At the end of 30 days, you'd get $1 million, plus you'd have earned $1 million for the first 29, $2 million. It can be figured. It takes a few minutes to figure it. 2 to the 30th power equals more than $1 million. All right. Anyway, go back 30 generations, you have about 2 million ancestors. Anyway, no, I've done some genealogical research, but I've never been able to link up to the line. You get to where, England went through a period of time during the Cromwell Revolution when they were not recording births. The churches were not recording births and deaths, and a lot of records have been burned and lost. But there's a lot of work being done in that field. All right, William the Conqueror, leaving him, the next one of importance. Now, there are several kings between William and Henry. There was Henry II. All right, William the Conqueror, next one of importance, Henry II. Henry II is the one who stole Louis VII's wife, the King of France's wife. Not really. I mean, actually, she left him after he divorced her. But he was the one who married Eleanor of Aquitaine, and as a result, he received a lot of French territory through his wife Eleanor. Now, folks, keep this in mind because this is eventually going to lead to a long war between England and France called the 100 Years' War, where the King of England was to claim that they had a right to the throne of the King of France. I believe one of you did a paper. It is either this guy or one of you did a paper on the 100 Years' War. And it might be someone who's absent now. But anyway, Henry II. Henry II set uniform laws throughout England. He said that every shire in England must have the same laws because up to the time, every judge was making his own laws. He said that the laws can only be made if the nobles agree, that judges cannot make law, and this is something we in America ought to really consider seriously. But common law was to replace local law. In other words, that way the power of the local courts was weakened. Then, now Henry did something here that has been the ruin of a lot of secular rulers. He took on the church. Folk, as recently as 1870, Otto von Bismarck, one of the most powerful princes of Europe, got into a squabble with the Pope, and Bismarck lost. So it's a serious issue. Anyway, the issue was who was to try clerics, in other words, priests and bishops. If a cleric misbehaved, who was to try him? The church said only we should try clerics. Henry said no, if a cleric misbehaves, the civil court should try him. Well, they had a squabble. So one day, the office of Archbishop of Canterbury, that's the highest church office in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury's office became vacant, and Henry thought, I know, I'm going to appoint my own man to be the Archbishop. So Henry appointed Thomas Becket, who was, he'd been a member of the church, but Becket was a worldly-minded man, and Henry thought I could control him. Well, here was the mistake. When Henry appointed Becket, Becket, who had never been much of a churchman before that, all of a sudden became what Henry made him. I mean, he not only started to dress like a churchman, he started to talk like a churchman, but more important, he even started to think like a churchman. And he took the church's side on every issue, and he opposed Henry in every way. And even the Pope wrote Becket a letter to say, hey, Thomas, we don't need this squabble right now, just cool it. Becket even fled to France for a while to escape Henry, but finally came back. Well, the feud continued. Henry was determined to have his way. And one day, Henry was sitting at a meal with a bunch of his knights, sitting down at a table. Keep in mind that Henry had a very violent temper. And someone brought a message, says, Your Majesty, here's something Thomas Becket did today. Henry looks at the message, he flew in a bit of rage. Oh, you dogs who sit around my table eating my food, can any of you dogs do something about this upstart cleric for me? Basically, that's what he said is, well, 4 knights decided, I guess he wants this man killed, so if we'd better do it. So these 4 knights got up from the table with their swords, went to see Thomas Becket. Basically, to make long, I mean, I've read detail, but to make long story short, there was an altercation, and these knights killed Thomas Becket. This turned out to be the worst mistake Henry ever made. All of a sudden, all of England, all of Europe cried foul. Henry had to do penance, and Henry simply had to give up his fight to take over church issues. Now later, the church acquiesced. That was many, many generations later, but Henry had to give up. Basically, Henry lost his fight with the church. All right, Henry had 4 sons, as I've already mentioned. The first was Richard the Lionhearted. He spent a lot of his time fighting on the Crusades. He's the one who released his mother Eleanor from prison. But the one I want to talk about now, this is Richard I. Now, you might notice, when I write the name John, he's not John I. He'll become John I if there's ever a John II. But the royal family has made it a point for the last 900 years to not name his sons John. John is the reason that the royal family today, they're still on the throne, but they have no authority. John was perhaps the worst king England ever had. As a son of Henry, I mean, if Henry had a vile temper, John's temper was so bad that when he threw a fit, even the dogs barked and ran out like dogs possessed. I mean, when he threw a fit, everybody left. I mean, he'd roll around on the floor and crawl under the carpet and anything else. I mean, he would throw violent fits. But one day John went to France because, after all, he'd inherited some land from his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And while in France, nobles got together. Now keep in mind, in those days, people did not assassinate careers. But the nobles got together and said, when he comes home, tell him he must sign his charter. John, when he came home, found every one of the nobles against him, not to dethrone him, but to say to him, your power is limited. The Magna Carta goes down as one of the greatest documents in the history of free peoples, in the history of democracy. If you actually look at it, and I did a paper on it when I was in graduate school, everything it says is practically meaningless to us today, obsolete. It was just simply saying the king cannot do this, the king cannot do that, and listed about 12 things that the king was not to do. Again, most of it seems meaningless to us today. But it was an attempt to tell the king, you're still king, but you may not do certain things. That power was to be shared between the king, between the nobles and the church, and his power was to be limited. In one of the greatest documents in the history of mankind, and some people have said that this is the reason that England still has kings and queens on the throne, unlike France. Today, France has no king, no queen. they got rid of theirs. But after John, the next king of importance, now I mean there were others, but it's Edward I. What I want to remember about him is he convened the first parliament. I remember when I was 10 years old, I learned that the United States has Congress, but England and Scotland have a parliament, which is like our Congress. That word is it's badly spelled in my handwriting. P-A-R-L-I-A-M-E-N-T. Essentially, why the king called parliament? He was running short on money. And he realized that if I arbitrarily raise a tax, my people might rebel or they might refuse to pay it. To make this tax legal, I've got to get all the nobles together. So he sent a letter to the nobility and said, assemble in London at a certain time, a certain day, and we're going to discuss some matters of government. So the nobility assembled in London, and he told them, now, all right, now, I have this need here. We need money for this, and we need money for that, and we need money for this. And I only have this much money, but I need this much. Parliament approved of the tax. This is very important because this was the beginning of the idea that taxation should only be had with the approval of the people who were being taxed. And this was to become very important in American history because while this meeting of Parliament occurred in the 1200s, 550 or so years later, England taxed the American colonies, and there were no representatives from the colonies in Parliament. This was to lead to the colonies rebelling. Again, the colonies were trying to get the English to say, hey, these laws have been on the books for 600 and 700, 300 and 400, 500, 600 years, and why are you making us not have to obey them now? Why are you not obeying them now? These laws have been on the books all these years. Anyway, taxation supposedly in the democracy can only be had when the people, common people, consent to it. Now, again, folks, I've got to inject this here. I mean, I'm talking right now, I'm jumping to the year 2016. Our people have, because the government does not have enough money to pay its obligations, the government has resorted to borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and then borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing again until today the government is probably deeper in debt. I'm talking the United States, not right here, deeper in debt than it can get out of. In Europe, the situation is bad. Europe has 5 nations called something called the PIGS, P-I-I-G-S, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And all these 5 countries are also very, very deeply into debt, and they cannot meet their obligations. Now, most of you probably have heard this from another source and know what I'm talking about. And eventually it might lead to a situation where some governments will default. I have to quit. Nobody knows for sure what would happen. Nobody knows for sure. But anyway, bad thing about democracy, the common people will vote to let their government go deeper and deeper into debt and vote themselves lower taxes, and also vote for higher government spending. Lower taxes and higher government spending. Lower taxes and higher government spending. Lower taxes, and somewhere, I don't know what's going to happen. All right, we'll move on. All right, that's England. There are 4 kings: William, Henry, John, and William, Henry, Richard, John, and Edward. Oh yeah, Edward I. Did I write that name down? Yeah, okay, all right. All right, now anyway, we're going to leave that and go on to France. The first king we'll talk about for France is Philip Augustus. I've already mentioned how the Philip Augustus, Philip was a son of Louis VII. And Louis VII finally had one son. After Louis VII's disastrous marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he married again and had only one son, Philip. Philip got the throne as a boy of 18. Now again, Louis VII was quite a bit older than Philip. And Philip had had several daughters, but only managed to have one son. Philip Augustus was a member of the Capetian dynasty. The Capetian dynasty, Philip was about the 8th ruler in the Capetian dynasty. What was supposed to happen was that when the French nobility made Hugh Capet the king, they said, no, when you die, we'll meet and appoint another king. Instead, Hugh Capet managed to have his son crowned his life. There was a biblical precedent for it. In the Bible, David had Solomon crowned while David was still alive. So these kings would have their sons crowned while they were still alive. And eventually it came down to where Philip Augustus was crowned as a boy of 18 while his father was alive. But before I get into that, I'm going to not jump ahead, but back up in the story just a little bit. When Philip was 16 years old, he went on a hunting trip by himself. Now, there was a saying that came out of this story. The saying was, save a nail, bad or worse, someday it might fill your purse. Now, I mean, that seems obvious. I have a lot of nails around my house now, and every time I start to throw away a rusty old bent up crooked nail, I'll think about this. The nails don't cost that much anymore, so I'll sometimes put away a bad old nail. But anyway, this became a saying as a result, and also another saying came out of this story. Because of the nail, the shoe was lost. Because of the shoe, the horse was lost. Because of the horse, the prince was lost. Okay, here's the story. Philip Augustus was a boy of 16. He was galloping off in the woods on a hunting trip. And keep in mind, only the nobility were allowed to hunt. But he was very high-born. I mean, he was the crown prince. So he was by himself on his hunting trip. And as he was on his hunting trip, a peasant called to him, hey, Your Excellency, Your Majesty, you've lost a nail on your horse's shoe. The young prince foolishly thought, stop this trip for a nail. It's not worth it. So the prince turned to Hopper and said, hey, keep it, my good man. You might be able to find some use for it around your home. And the prince galloped off into the woods with a nail missing off on his horse's shoe. Well, because that one shoe was missing a nail, the shoe came loose. Another nail came off. And after a while, the horse was without one of its shoes, which meant the horse was no longer able to hold the prince, and the horse could only hobble. I mean, very, very bad for the prince. In the meantime, it got dark and cold, and the prince became very ill. Fortunately for the prince, the horse was able to hobble back to where the farmer had lived. And when the farmer saw the prince, the farmer immediately was able to get the shoe, found the nail that the prince had abandoned, and the other nails, some of them in the prince's pocket, get the shoe back on the horse, and then gallop off to tell the government that, hey, I have the crown prince here, and he is very ill. When the old king heard that his son was at a pauper's home and extremely ill, the old king was just beside himself with terror, because he thought, hey, this could be the end of my dynasty here, and I'll never have another son. Anyway, the old king was willing to do anything to save his son, so he went to the church. The church said, go visit the tomb of Thomas Becket, and your son will get well. Well, the king did not really want to go visit the king who had taken his first wife away, but he was willing to do anything, so he went and visited the tomb of Thomas Becket. The king and Henry, Louis VII Henry, did gallop off together and had a private conversation, but Louis VII was in no mood to fight. He was concerned for his son. Make long story short, Philip Augustus did recover. Shortly afterwards, once he was fully well, King Louis VII had him crowned. And folks, this can sometimes be a big mistake. Once Louis VII had crowned his son king, Louis VII's health failed like lightning, and in short order he was gone. It reminds me of Bear Bryant. Bear Bryant retired 1 month and died the next. This happened to my dad. He retired on July 31st and died August the 11th. Why don't I quit work? Retirement is the worst thing you can tell your body to do. Your body goes into a shutdown mode. You can change careers. Now, nothing wrong with changing careers. To quit, oh my, can be disastrous. Anyway, Philip Augustus got the throne as a boy of 18. He reformed the tax system. He began to collect money instead of soldiers. Wealth had increased, trade had increased. He was able to conquer several of the biggest duchies in the land, including Normandy, Maine, and Anjou, several counties. He, unlike Henry, who had curtailed the power of the courts, he increased the power of the royal courts. Essentially, he did a lot to improve and strengthen the power of the King of France. And all told, this was to give the French people a stronger government later. All right, I'm going to stop here, and we'll take up one Wednesday with Philip the Fair, whom I really want to elaborate on a little bit more. All right. Anybody have any questions, comments? Okay, folk, I might be a little bit slow getting this lecture online, and by the way, nobody seems to know it, but the lecture I put online last time somebody did this did not work. I was informed of it, and I'm bad having a bunch of email on it. I was informed of one of the students that went to talk class, and yes, it did not work in class. It should work now. So the lecture that I did on last week, as for this lecture today's, I'm going to try my best to get it online today. I'm not sure that I can, though. Anyway, I'm going to try to. All right, anyway, those of you, a few of you who might have tried to see the last lecture, it will work. And by the way, those of you who turned in papers, if you don't think you have your paper, go to Turnitin and make sure I have your paper and have it graded. And also, folks, do go to iCollege. You won't find your paper grade on iCollege. I want you to get that from Turnitin. I want you to read the comments I made. But go to iCollege. Be sure you've taken enough tests. Be sure you have taken all 3 passes. Now check your pass average, check your test average, make sure it's as high as you can make it. And if you've missed a test, if you missed a pass, see, I'm not going to track you down. You're old enough, you find me. I've given 3 makeup tests in the last 2 classes. I'm willing to stay right now and give one now if any of you want to take one. Everybody, I'll see you on Wednesday.